The Crusades, the most complex and influential historical phenomenon in East-West relations. The Crusades represent one of the most complex and controversial phenomena in human history, marking a pivotal turning point in relations between the Islamic and Christian worlds and causing profound changes in the trajectory of both civilizations. This series of religious political wars that spanned the 11th to 13th centuries, 1096 to 1291 CE, was not merely a transient military conflict but a multidimensional phenomenon encompassing religion, politics, economics, society, and culture, leaving deep impacts still felt to this day. Chronologically, the Crusader era lasted approximately 2 centuries, witnessing a sequence of major military campaigns and bloody confrontations interspersed with periods of relative calm and limited coexistence. Historians typically divide this epoch into 3 main phases: the phase of Crusader expansion, 1096 to 1144 CE, which saw the success of the First Crusade and establishment of Crusader states; the phase of equilibrium, 1144 to 1187 CE, marked by the emergence of Islamic counteraction led by the Zengids; and the phase of decline, 1187 to 1291 CE, which ended with the expulsion of the last Crusader presence from the Levant. Geographically, the Crusader-Islamic conflict zone stretched from the Atlantic coasts in the west, where the campaigns originated, to the fringes of Mesopotamia in the east, and from Anatolia in the north to Egypt in the south. This vast expanse transformed the conflict into a major regional phenomenon involving multiple powers from across the known world at that time, including Western European kingdoms, the Byzantine Empire, Islamic states in Syria and Egypt, Turkish forces in Anatolia, and even distant Asian powers like the Mongols. The Crusades represented a genuine test for both Islamic and Christian civilizations of that era. On one hand, they revealed the political and military weaknesses of the Islamic world, particularly amid the fragmentation and division between the Abbasid Caliphate, Fatimids, and Seljuks. On the other hand, they exposed the limitations of European vision and organizational capabilities, despite their initial military successes. This mutual test left valuable lessons for both sides and profoundly influenced their subsequent development. From a religious perspective, the Crusades are often portrayed as embodying the clash between the Islamic concept of jihad and the Christian notion of holy war. However, this simplistic reading does not do justice to the historical phenomenon, as the actual motivations were far more complex and intertwined, varying among different actors and across different time periods. While religious motives may have predominated among some participants, especially in early stages, other political, economic, and social factors played equally important, if not greater, roles at various times. On the social level, the Crusades served as a safety valve for Europe, which was experiencing increasing demographic and social pressures at the time. These wars opened new horizons of wealth and power beyond crowded Europe for various social groups, knights, nobles, commoners, and merchants alike. They also contributed to reshaping European social structures, particularly with the rise of a new class of professional knights and wealthy merchants who benefited from opportunities created by the Crusades. Economically, the impact of the Crusades on the emerging global economic system cannot be underestimated. These wars helped revive international trade after a long stagnation by reopening trade routes between East and West that had been partially disrupted by previous conflicts. They played a crucial role in the prosperity of Italian trading cities like Venice, Genoa, and Pisa, which served as commercial intermediaries between the two worlds and established extensive trade networks capitalizing on the new circumstances. Militarily, the Crusader era witnessed significant developments in the arts of war and fortification. Through direct contact between both sides, Crusaders and Muslims exchanged combat expertise, each learning from the other's tactics and techniques, leading to noticeable evolution in military methods on both sides. This period also saw major advancements in fortress construction, with magnificent examples of military architecture in castles like Carrick, Croc de Chevaliers, and Safed. The Crusades left behind an enormous architectural heritage that still stands today as testimony to this historical period. The imposing Crusader castles scattered throughout the Levant and the Islamic fortifications built by leaders like Saladin constitute tangible evidence of this prolonged conflict and the evolution of military architecture during that era. The Crusaders also left numerous religious and civil buildings blending European and Eastern architectural styles, demonstrating a degree of cultural exchange despite the conflict. Culturally and intellectually, the Crusader period formed an important bridge for knowledge transfer between East and West. Despite the wartime conditions, direct contact allowed Europeans to become acquainted with Islamic scientific and philosophical heritage, while Muslims learned about aspects of European civilization. This intellectual exchange, though initially limited, later contributed to sparking the European Renaissance as many scientific and philosophical texts were translated from Arabic into Latin during and after this period. The major challenge in studying the Crusades lies in the multiplicity and occasional contradiction of narratives and perspectives about them. While contemporary European sources present them as a religious liberation movement to reclaim the Holy Land, Islamic sources generally depict them as colonial aggression and foreign invasion. These disparities in historical narratives make it difficult to arrive at a balanced, objective understanding of events, requiring researchers to critically examine and compare sources carefully to reach a more accurate historical picture. On the human level, there is no denying that the Crusader era represented a genuine tragedy for populations living in conflict zones who suffered the ravages of war. The massacres committed in Jerusalem, Acre, Antioch, and other cities by both sides remind us of the brutality of religious conflict when it turns into a clash of identities and civilizations. The human suffering left by these prolonged wars, killing, displacement, and destruction forms a dark aspect of this period dominated by violence and conflict. Yet it's important to note that relations between Crusaders and Muslims were not always confrontational. There were long periods of relative peaceful coexistence, regular trade relations, and even political and military alliances between some Crusader and Islamic powers against third parties. These complex interactions prove that the reality was not always black and white, and that actual relations were more nuanced than some simplified narratives suggest. The Crusades deeply influenced the formation of modern European identity. Through contact with Islamic civilization, Europeans began redefining their identity in contrast to the Eastern other, a process that significantly contributed to the later development of European national consciousness. The European discovery of Islamic advancements in science, arts, and material life also caused a certain civilizational shock that helped bring Europe out of its relative isolation. Conversely, the conflict with the Crusaders profoundly affected the development of Islamic political and military thought. The emergence of leadership figures like Imad ad-Din Zengi, Nur ad-Din Mahmud, and Saladin, along with the evolution of jihad as a response to Crusader invasion, all contributed to formulating a new Islamic perspective on relations with the West. The confrontation with Crusaders also helped reorganize Islamic armies and develop their combat methods and administration. Today, more than 7 centuries after the end of the Crusader era, these events remain powerfully present in contemporary political and religious discourse. The historical period is frequently invoked to explain current conflicts between the Islamic world and the West, reflecting the great symbolic importance of these events in collective memory. This historical referencing, despite sometimes being oversimplified, underscores the need for accurate and comprehensive understanding of the Crusades in their proper historical context. Methodologically, this book adopts a comprehensive approach combining political and military analysis with examination of cultural, social, and economic aspects. It attempts to present a balanced perspective considering the different viewpoints of participating parties, relying on a wide range of European, Islamic, and Byzantine sources while benefiting from the latest modern historical research. Ultimately, studying the Crusades remains essential not only for understanding the past but also for comprehending the present and anticipating the future. This historical period does not merely represent events that happened and ended, but serves as a key to understanding many of the transformations and tensions characterizing contemporary East-West relations. Through its comprehensive and objective presentation, this book attempts to provide readers with this profound perspective on one of the most fascinating and influential chapters in human history. On November 27, 1095, in an open square outside the Church of Clermont in southern France, Pope Urban II, 1088–1099, stood before a crowd comprising hundreds of bishops, nobles, clergy, and common people to deliver a historic speech that ignited the spark of one of the most complex and influential religious military movements in European and Islamic history. This speech was not merely a casual call to arms but rather a pivotal moment in the relationship between the Christian and Islamic worlds, marking a significant turning point in the evolution of political and religious thought during the Middle Ages. Pope Urban II's call came within a complex historical context, as Western Europe was suffering from deep internal divisions. Religiously, the Catholic Church was still reeling from the effects of the investiture controversy between the papacy and the Holy Roman Empire. Politically, the European continent was divided among competing kingdoms, principalities, and feudal estates engaged in near-constant warfare. Socially, Europe was experiencing increasing demographic pressures due to improved climatic and agricultural conditions during what was known as the medieval warm period, creating growing demand for land and resources. On the other side of the Mediterranean, the Islamic world was undergoing a period of political fragmentation. While the Abbasid Caliphate in Baghdad was experiencing significant weakness, Egypt was under Fatimid control, and the Seljuk Turks dominated much of the Levant and Anatolia. This political disintegration, despite accompanying cultural and scientific flourishing, left the Islamic world vulnerable to any organized external threat. Jerusalem, with its sanctity to the three Abrahamic faiths, formed the central link in this conflict. Since the Muslim conquest of Jerusalem in 638 AD, Muslims had allowed Christians freedom of pilgrimage to holy sites, although this freedom faced occasional restrictions. However, certain events, such as the persecution of Christian pilgrims by the Fatimid Caliph al-Hakim Bay'amar Allah in the early 11th century, provided the papacy with pretexts to portray Muslims as enemies of Christianity. In this charged atmosphere, Pope Urban II's speech embodied a comprehensive strategic vision. Religiously, the Pope presented the campaign as a means to liberate the Holy Land from the defilement of infidels, promising participants complete remission of sins. Politically, the call represented a clever attempt to unify Western Christianity under papal leadership and redirect the energies of European knights from internal conflicts to an external war. Economically, the campaign offered a solution to the problem of younger noble sons excluded from inheritance under the feudal system of primogeniture. Pope Urban II employed emotionally powerful language in his speech, describing alleged violations against Christian pilgrims in the East. According to contemporary accounts, he depicted the suffering of Eastern Christians in dramatic terms and described the desecration of holy sites in a manner that stirred the audience's emotions. The historian Fulcher of Chartres, one of those present at the council, recounts how the crowd shouted with one voice Deus vult. God wills it. In response to the Pope's speech, however, deeper historical analysis reveals that the Crusades' motivations were more complex than mere religious reasons. Clearly, Pope Urban II sought to strengthen the papacy's position after a bitter struggle with the empire over the appointment of bishops. Moreover, the timing of the call came shortly after the Pope's internal conflict with Antipope Clement III, making the call for an external campaign an effective means of unifying ranks behind him. Socially, the call came at a time when Europe was suffering from a crisis of idle knights, trained warriors who found no employment in times of relative peace. The crusade offered them opportunities for plunder and social status. As for the poor peasants, they saw in the campaign a chance to escape lives of poverty and feudal oppression. On the Islamic side, there was no preparation for a confrontation of this magnitude. The Islamic world, despite its cultural and scientific richness, was suffering from deep political and military divisions. While the Crusaders advanced, the Seljuks and Fatimids were preoccupied with their internal conflicts, weakening their ability to confront the invasion. Analysis of the texts of Pope Urban II's speech, as transmitted by contemporary historians, shows how he used religious discourse carrying underlying political and economic dimensions. While he focused on religious motivations in his public speech, secret correspondence between the Pope and European leaders revealed more complex geopolitical and economic considerations. Militarily, the Clermont Call marked the beginning of the development of the concept of holy war in Western Christianity. While early Christianity generally rejected violence, the medieval church developed a new theology justifying war when ordered by the Pope and for religious purposes. This profound intellectual transformation would have far-reaching effects on the evolution of political and religious thought in Europe. Culturally, the Clermont Call contributed to reshaping the image of the other in the European imagination. The stereotype of Muslims as enemies of Christianity, which had begun forming before the Crusades, found strong institutional expression in Pope Urban II's speech, later evolving into what became known as Orientalism in subsequent eras. The effects of the Clermont Call were both immediate and far-reaching. In the months following the speech, waves of religious enthusiasm spread throughout Europe, leading to what became known as the People's Crusade that preceded the official First Crusade. This popular crusade, led by figures like Peter the Hermit, was an early example of how religious discourse could transform into a massive popular movement, despite the chaos and violence that accompanied it, particularly against Jewish communities in Europe. Historically, it can be said that the Clermont Call represented a turning point in relations between Europe and the Islamic world. Before 1095, relations between the two sides had been limited and intermittent, characterized mostly by limited trade and cultural exchange. But after Pope Urban II's call, the two worlds entered into direct and prolonged conflict that would last for centuries and profoundly influence the development of both civilizations. In conclusion, it can be said that Pope Urban II's speech at the Council of Clermont was not merely a passing event in history but rather a foundational moment for a movement that would change the face of the world. Through this speech, the Pope succeeded in unifying the warring European powers under one banner, redirecting European military energy from internal to external affairs, and initiating a process of contact and interaction, though mostly conflictual, between Christian and Islamic civilizations that would have profound effects on the development of both. When we speak of the Crusades, we are not discussing an isolated event or sudden decision, but rather a complex historical phenomenon deeply rooted in the political, religious, and social transformations of 11th century Europe. To fully comprehend this phenomenon, we must first thoroughly examine the historical context that gave birth to it, which can be divided into three main axes: the situation in Western Europe, the state of the Islamic world, and the condition of the Byzantine Empire, with particular focus on Jerusalem's place in the religious consciousness of both sides. In 11th century Europe, the continent was undergoing a major transition. Politically, Europe witnessed the disintegration of the Carolingian Empire and the rise of the feudal system that fragmented power among hundreds of princes and feudal lords. This fragmentation was accompanied by constant local wars between feudal lords, creating a large class of professional knights who found themselves idle during periods of relative peace. On the other hand, the papacy was strengthening its influence following the Gregorian reform, which sought to liberate the church from imperial and feudal control, leading to the famous investiture controversy between the papacy and the empire. Economically and socially, Europe was experiencing what might be called a crisis of success. Improved climatic conditions during what is known as the medieval warm period led to increased agricultural production and significant population growth. However, this very growth created pressure on resources, especially under the feudal inheritance system that deprived younger sons of nobles of their inheritance, creating a class of dispossessed lesser nobles seeking opportunities for wealth and social status. Simultaneously, European cities began to grow noticeably with the flourishing of trade and crafts, creating new social forces looking for expansion opportunities. Religiously, the 11th century saw intensifying religious sentiment in Europe. Ecclesiastical peace movements spread, attempting to limit wars between Christians, while the concept of just war developed in ecclesiastical thought. Pilgrimages to holy sites increased, especially with improved transportation routes and relative security compared to previous centuries. But these religious sentiments were mixed with apocalyptic fears as the year 1100 approached, making many more receptive to the idea of atoning for sins through heroic religious acts. On the other side of the Mediterranean, the Islamic world was experiencing a completely different situation. Politically, the Islamic world suffered from fragmentation and division. The Abbasid Caliphate in Baghdad had lost most of its actual power to local forces. In Egypt, the Fatimid Caliphate was plagued by internal crises, while the Seljuk Turks, who controlled most of the Levant and Anatolia, were experiencing internal divisions after the death of Sultan Malik Shah in 1092. This political fragmentation left the Islamic world unprepared for any organized external threat. Militarily, the Seljuk army relied mainly on light Turkish cavalry that excelled in open field battles but was less effective in prolonged siege warfare. Defensive fortifications in Levantine cities had deteriorated after years of neglect. Dependence on mercenary armies and divisions among local princes made military coordination difficult against any organized invasion. Economically, the Islamic world was experiencing relative prosperity. Trade routes between East and West flourished, and major cities like Aleppo, Damascus, and Cairo were centers of crafts and industries. However, the sophisticated tax system was burdensome for the population, weakening their loyalty to ruling authorities. This very economic prosperity made the region attractive to invaders from the north. The Byzantine Empire, representing the major Christian power in the east, was suffering deep crises. After the catastrophic defeat at Massacre in 1071 against the Seljuks, the Byzantines lost most of Anatolia. Internal struggles for the Byzantine throne weakened the state, and the Byzantine army was in significant decline. Emperor Alexios I Komnenos, 1081–1118, was desperate for military assistance from the west to recover lost territories but simultaneously suspicious of Western intentions, especially after the Great Schism between Eastern and Western churches in 1054. Amid these major transformations, Jerusalem held a central place in the religious consciousness of both sides. For Christians, Jerusalem was the heart of Christian faith, the site of Christ's crucifixion and resurrection. Pilgrimage to Jerusalem was considered a major act of piety and had increased in the 11th century. In Islam, Jerusalem held special status as the first Qibla and the site of the Prophet Muhammad's night journey. Politically, Muslim rulers generally tolerated Christian pilgrims, despite some periods of tension like during the reign of the Fatimid Caliph al-Hakim. International trade routes played an important role in this context. The Silk Road and Mediterranean sea routes were sources of wealth for all but also of competition. Italian cities like Venice, Genoa, and Pisa competed for control of these routes and saw the Crusades as an opportunity to expand their commercial influence. When we combine all these elements, we see that the Crusades were not the result of a single cause but rather the product of complex interactions among many political, economic, social, and religious factors in Europe and the Islamic world. In Europe, there was an urgent need to channel excess military energy, a desire to unify Christianity under papal leadership, and economic ambitions for expansion toward the wealthier East. In the Islamic world, political fragmentation and preoccupation with internal conflicts had weakened defensive capabilities. The Byzantine Empire, unable to defend itself, was trying to exploit European powers to its advantage. All these factors combined created ideal conditions for the outbreak of one of history's most influential movements in East-West relations, the First Crusade, 1096–1099, comprehensive analysis. The First Crusade, 1096–1099, represents a major turning point in the history of East-West relations, marking the first organized clash between European Christian forces and the Islamic world in the Middle East. This three-year campaign witnessed dramatic shifts in regional power dynamics and established a permanent Crusader presence in the Levant that would last nearly 2 centuries. In this comprehensive analysis, we will examine this campaign from all political, military, social, and religious perspectives, focusing on the factors that led to its surprising success despite numerous challenges. Immediate historical context. Following Pope Urban II's speech at the Council of Clermont in 1095, serious preparations began for the First Crusade. Participants could be divided into 3 main categories: knights and nobles who formed the military backbone, clergy who provided religious legitimacy, and commoners including peasants and poor folk motivated by religious and economic reasons. Notably, the First Crusade actually consisted of 2 distinct campaigns: the disorganized People's Crusade led by Peter the Hermit that ended in disaster, and the main organized campaign led by European nobles and princes, the People's Crusade, 1096. The People's Crusade began in spring 1096, months before the main campaign's departure. This popular movement was led by French preacher Peter the Hermit, who managed to rally thousands of peasants and poor people from across France and German regions. These groups completely lacked military organization and sufficient funding, suffering from shortages of supplies and weapons. During their march through Europe, these crusaders committed a series of massacres against Jewish communities in cities like Speyer, Worms, and Mainz, claiming Jews as Christ killers who deserved punishment even before reaching the Holy Land. These events represent some of the earliest organized anti-Jewish violence in European history. When these crowds reached Constantinople, Byzantine Emperor Alexios I Komnenos hurriedly shipped them across to Anatolia to be rid of them. There, in October 1096, disaster struck when Turkish forces attacked them near Nicaea. Most participants in this popular crusade were killed or captured and sold into slavery, with only a handful including Peter the Hermit escaping back to Constantinople to await the main crusading forces. The main crusade, 1096 to 1099. The principal crusading armies departed in late summer 1096, several months after the People's Crusade. These forces consisted of 4 main armies, each led by prominent European nobles. 1. The Lorraine army led by Godfrey of Bouillon and his brother Baldwin of Bouillon. 2. The southern Italian Norman army led by Bohemond of Taranto and his nephew Tancred. 3. The Provençal army led by Raymond of St. Gilles, Count of Toulouse. 4. The northern French army led by Robert of Flanders and Stephen of Blois. These armies took different routes to Constantinople, the agreed rendezvous point before crossing into Anatolia. They arrived at Constantinople in stages between November 1096 and April 1097. Emperor Alexios I Komnenos faced a major dilemma. While he desperately needed their military assistance against the Seljuk Turks, he also feared their expansionist ambitions. To resolve this, he demanded the Crusader leaders swear oaths of fealty to him and acknowledge his sovereignty over any lands they reclaimed from the Muslims. Siege of Nicaea, May-June 1097. Nicaea, modern-day Iznik, Turkey, became the Crusaders' first major military objective. This city held great strategic importance as capital of the Seljuk Sultanate of Rum. The siege began on May 14, 1097, with combined Crusader and Byzantine forces participating. The siege demonstrated initial cooperation between Crusaders and Byzantines but also revealed early tensions. When the city fell on June 19, 1097, Byzantine troops entered first by imperial command, preventing the Crusaders from looting as they had hoped. This incident left many Crusaders bitter toward their Byzantine allies. Battle of Dorylaeum, July 1, 1097. After Nicaea, the Crusader forces marched south through Anatolia. On July 1, 1097, they encountered the main Seljuk army under Sultan Kilij Arslan I at Dorylaeum. The battle proved a crucial test of Crusader military capabilities. Despite initial surprise and difficulties, the Crusaders achieved decisive victory thanks to their heavy cavalry superiority and effective coordination among their various contingents. This victory opened the way for their continued advance through Anatolia, though at significant cost in lives and equipment. The Cilician crisis and Baldwin's exploits. During the march across Anatolia, divisions began emerging among Crusader leaders. Baldwin of Bouillon, brother of Godfrey of Bouillon, broke away from the main army with a small force of knights and headed toward Armenia and Cilicia. There, he became embroiled in local conflicts between Armenian and Turkish rulers, ultimately establishing the first Crusader state at Edessa, modern Sanliurfa, Turkey, in March 1098. This event marked the first clear deviation from the Crusades' proclaimed goal, liberating Jerusalem, and revealed some leaders' ambitions to carve out personal dominions. Siege of Antioch, October 1097 to June 1098. Antioch, ancient capital of Roman Syria, became the Crusaders' next major objective. The siege began on October 21, 1097, lasting 7.5 months, one of the longest sieges of the Middle Ages. During this grueling siege, the Crusaders faced tremendous hardships, supply shortages, disease, Muslim relief force attacks, and growing divisions among their leaders. The crisis peaked in winter 1097 to 1098 when Crusaders suffered such severe famine they reportedly resorted to eating horses, leather, and even dead bodies. The situation changed in May 1098 when a large Muslim relief army under Kerboga of Mosul approached. In desperate straits, the Crusaders managed to breach the city's defenses on June 3, 1098, allegedly with help from a traitor inside. Once inside, they found themselves besieged in turn by Kerboga's forces. At this critical juncture, Crusader Peter Bartholomew claimed to have discovered the Holy Lance, which pierced Christ's side, beneath Antioch's cathedral. This discovery dramatically boosted Crusader morale, and on June 28, 1098, they launched a surprise attack against Kerboga's numerically superior forces, achieving a stunning victory. Divisions and internal conflicts. After Antioch's fall, disputes erupted among Crusader leaders over who should rule the city. Bohemond of Taranto, who had played a key role in capturing Antioch, declared himself prince, despite objections from Raymond of St. Gilles and others. These disagreements delayed the Crusades' continuation toward Jerusalem for 6 full months, giving Muslim forces time to regroup. March to Jerusalem, January-June 1099. In January 1099, the Crusaders resumed their march toward the ultimate goal. They chose to follow the coastal route to ensure supplies from Italian fleets. During this phase, they encountered limited resistance from local Muslim rulers, who often preferred paying tribute or making truces rather than direct confrontation. On June 7, 1099, the Crusaders finally reached Jerusalem's walls, then under Fatimid Egyptian control. Siege of Jerusalem, June 7 to July 15, 1099. The Siege of Jerusalem became the final test of Crusader determination and capabilities. The city was well fortified, and Crusaders again suffered from supply and water shortages in the brutal summer heat. However, the arrival of Italian fleets at Jaffa in mid-June provided materials for siege towers and war machines. On July 15, 1099, after 5 weeks of siege, Crusaders breached Jerusalem's northern defenses. What followed remains one of the most controversial episodes in Crusader history. Fall of Jerusalem and massacres. According to contemporary sources from both sides, Crusaders committed horrific massacres after entering Jerusalem. Thousands of the city's Muslim, Jewish, and even Eastern Christian inhabitants were slaughtered. Crusader Raymond of Aguilars described scenes where, in the Temple of Solomon, men rode in blood up to their knees. These events left deep scars in Muslim collective memory, becoming symbols of Crusader brutality in later Islamic literature. Establishment of the Kingdom of Jerusalem. After occupying Jerusalem, Crusaders elected Godfrey of Bouillon as ruler, though he refused to be crowned king in the city where Christ had worn the crown of thorns. The Crusaders immediately began organizing their new kingdom, dividing conquered territories among leading nobles. On August 12, 1099, Godfrey defeated a large Fatimid relief army at Ascalon, securing Crusader control of the region. Military analysis of the campaign's success. The First Crusade's surprising success can be attributed to several key military factors. 1. Tactical superiority of Crusader heavy cavalry in field battles. 2. Divisions among Muslim powers and lack of coordination. 3. Skill in siege warfare and military engineering. 4. Religious zeal that motivated Crusaders to endure hardships. 5. Logistical support from Italian fleets and initial Byzantine assistance. Long-term consequences and impact. The First Crusade established 4 main Crusader states in the Levant. 1. Kingdom of Jerusalem, 1099 to 1291, 2. County of Edessa, 1098 to 1150, 3. Principality of Antioch, 1098 to 1268, 4. County of Tripoli, 1109 to 1289. These political entities, despite their small size and demographic weakness, managed to endure for nearly 2 centuries thanks to sophisticated fortification systems and continuous European support. The First Crusade's success also inspired subsequent crusades, though most failed to achieve similar success. Conclusion: the First Crusade represents a unique historical phenomenon combining religious zeal, political ambition, and military adventure. Its unexpected success resulted less from Crusader superiority than from the Muslim world's weakness and disunity at that particular moment. This campaign permanently altered the Middle East's political and cultural landscape, establishing a lasting conflict between East and West whose repercussions remain evident today. The establishment of Crusader states in the Levant, a comprehensive analytical study. The experience of the Crusader states in the Levant, 1099 to 1291, represents an exceptional historical phenomenon worthy of in-depth study, where a group of invaders from Europe succeeded in establishing political and social entities foreign to the region that lasted nearly 200 years. This unique phenomenon raises numerous questions about the nature of these states, their governance methods, their relations with local populations, and the reasons behind their eventual collapse, foundation, and emergence. Following the success of the First Crusade and the fall of Jerusalem in July 1099, the Crusaders began organizing their possessions in the Levant. This was not a planned or systematic process, but rather evolved gradually in response to local conditions. 4 main entities emerged during this period. 1. Kingdom of Jerusalem, 1099–1291. The heart of the Crusader project in the Levant, encompassing at its peak most of Palestine and parts of modern Lebanon and Syria. The Crusader leaders chose Godfrey of Bouillon as ruler of the new kingdom, though he refused to be crowned king in the city where Christ had suffered, preferring the title Defender of the Holy Sepulchre. After his death in 1100, his brother Baldwin I took power and had no hesitation in crowning himself king, beginning a dynasty that lasted until 1187.2. County of Edessa, 1098–1150. Founded by Baldwin of Bouillon in 1098 when he separated from the main Crusader army heading to northern Syria. This was the most inland of the Crusader states and most exposed to Muslim pressures, falling first to Zengi in 1144.3. Principality of Antioch, 1098–1268. Founded by Bohemond of Taranto after capturing the city in 1098. It was characterized by complex relations with the Byzantine Empire and its strategic position as a bridge between East and West. 4. County of Tripoli, 1109–1289. The last to be established after a long siege led by Raymond of St. Gilles and his son Bertrand. It relied heavily on support from Europe, particularly southern France. Political and administrative systems. The Crusader states, particularly the Kingdom of Jerusalem, developed unique political systems blending European feudal traditions with the requirements of governing in an Eastern environment. In theory, the King of Jerusalem held absolute power, but in practice his authority was constrained by the High Court, Haute Cour, comprising the kingdom's major barons. This court had extensive legislative and judicial powers, even the right to elect the king if the ruling dynasty ended. The kingdom was divided into 4 major fiefs: Jaffa and Ascalon, Galilee, Sidon, and Beirut, plus territories under direct royal control including Jerusalem itself and Acre after its capture in 1104. Each fief was further subdivided, creating a complex network of feudal relationships among the ruling classes, demographic composition, and intercommunal relations. The European Crusaders formed a small ruling minority facing a majority of local Muslim and Eastern Christian populations. In urban areas like Jerusalem, the Crusaders imposed a system separating themselves from native inhabitants, while in rural areas Islamic life continued almost unchanged with minimal Crusader interference. The county of Edessa had a unique demographic composition with an Armenian majority population. It relied on alliances with local Armenian princes and saw significant intermarriage between Crusaders and Armenians. These characteristics made Edessa the most adapted to the local environment but also the least internally cohesive military system and fortifications, facing constant security challenges. The Crusader states developed an integrated defensive system whose main features included 1. A network of massive castles like Carrick, Belfort, and Safed, whose remains still stand today as testaments to Crusader military engineering prowess. 2. A standing military system based on military religious orders like the Knights Templar and Hospitaller, who developed advanced systems of military administration and financing. 3. Local troops of Turco-Poles, local soldiers of mixed origins, who bridged Crusaders and native populations. 4. Dependence on European mercenaries during major crises, especially from Italy and southern France. Economic life. The Crusader states' economy rested on 3 main sectors. 1. Agriculture, particularly sugar cane, which the Crusaders introduced to Europe, cotton, olives, and grapes, and grains. The Crusaders maintained the existing Islamic agricultural system with some modifications to meet European market demands. 2. Trade. The Crusader states became a commercial bridge between East and West, facilitating the flow of spices and silk from the Far East, glass and soap from Syrian cities, and weapons and textiles from Europe. Coastal cities like Acre and Tyre flourished as major trading centers. 3. Craft industries, especially glass and soap production in Tyre, textiles in Tripoli, and weapons in Antioch. Cultural and artistic life. The Crusaders developed a distinctive architectural style blending European and Eastern elements, evident in 1. Churches like the renovated Church of the Holy Sepulchre, combining Romanesque style and early Gothic vaulting with Eastern architectural elements. 2. Castles with their characteristic round towers and sophisticated defense systems that Crusaders learned from local military expertise. 3. civic buildings like covered markets and public baths that adopted Islamic architectural traditions with some modifications. In arts, the Crusader states saw flourishing mosaic work, decorative sculpture, and illuminated manuscripts, developing a distinctive Crusader style blending Byzantine, Islamic, and Western influences. Relations with the Islamic world. Crusader-Muslim relations oscillated between conflict and coexistence. During conflicts, major battles occurred like Hattin, 1187, leading to Jerusalem's fall, the Siege of Acre, 1189 to 1191, and 13th-century battles against the Ayyubids then Mamluks. But between conflicts, there were long periods of peaceful coexistence featuring active trade, temporary political alliances, and cultural scientific exchange. Many Crusader rulers maintained friendly relations with certain Muslim princes, exchanging gifts and ambassadors, even occasionally allying with them against other Crusaders or rival Muslim rulers. Reasons for collapse. The Crusader states' fall resulted from several interrelated factors. 1. Demographic challenges. The Crusaders remained a small minority amid local populations, making them perpetually dependent on immigration and aid from Europe. 2. Internal divisions. Crusader leaders competed for power and resources, often allying with Muslims against each other, weakening unified resistance. 3. Rise of unified Muslim powers, especially under the Zengids, Ayyubids, then Mamluks, who developed effective military strategies against the Crusaders. 4. Declining European support. After the 13th century, European interest in crusading waned as energies shifted elsewhere. 5. Changes in international trade routes. Europeans developed direct trade routes with the Far East via the Mediterranean, reducing the Crusader states' strategic importance. Historical legacy. Despite their disappearance in the late 13th century, the Crusader states left enduring impacts. 1. In European history, they provided an early model for colonial expansion and influenced the development of feudal and legal systems in Europe. 2. In the Islamic world, they left bitter memories shaping perceptions of the West and influenced the evolution of jihad concepts and Islamic unity. 3. In interfaith relations, they represented a model of Christian-Muslim interaction, between conflict and coexistence, still affecting East-West relations today. 4. In military history, through advances in castle building and Crusader warfare that influenced military development in Europe and the Islamic world. Conclusion. The Crusader states in the Levant represent a unique historical experiment in civilizational interaction. Despite initial hostility, they gradually became bridges for cultural and economic exchange between East and West. Their study offers rich insights into interfaith and intercultural relations, and how invaders could become neighbors, albeit temporarily. They also provide important lessons about the limits of military power without demographic and cultural foundations, and the necessity of positive engagement with local populations for any settler project. Daily life in the Crusader states. A civilization between conflict and coexistence. The daily life in the Crusader states presents a unique model of cultural interaction between East and West during the Middle Ages. For nearly 2 centuries, 1099 to 1291, multi-religious and multicultural communities lived under Crusader rule, creating a complex social fabric combining European, Islamic, and Eastern Christian elements. This chapter examines in detail various aspects of daily life in the Crusader states, from cities and villages to markets and bathhouses, from palaces to peasant huts, and from the lives of the ruling elite to those of common farmers and artisans. 1. Demographic composition. A multicultural mosaic. The population of the Crusader states was divided into several main groups. First, the European Crusaders, Franks, who formed the ruling class. Their numbers were relatively limited, estimated by historians at about 100 to 120,000 people at the kingdom's peak, mostly living in major cities like Jerusalem, Acre, and Tyre. They maintained their distinct European identity but gradually absorbed local influences. Second, Eastern Christians, Orthodox, Syriacs, Armenians, Maronites, who constituted the majority of Christian population. Their relationship with the Crusaders was complex. While some welcomed them as liberators from Muslim rule, others resented Latin Church dominance. Third, Muslims who formed the majority in rural areas, particularly in Galilee and Transjordan. They maintained their religion and traditions under Crusader rule, though with some restrictions in holy cities like Jerusalem. Fourth, Jews who lived in small communities in major cities, especially Acre and Tyre. They faced less persecution under Crusader rule compared to some periods of Islamic rule. Point 2. Urban life, crucible of cultural fusion. Crusader cities witnessed the most intense civilizational interaction. Major cities included Jerusalem, transformed into an almost exclusively Christian city after the Crusader conquest. Muslims and Jews were initially expelled, then some allowed back as craftsmen and traders. The city was divided into religious quarters, with Crusaders concentrated around the Church of Holy Sepulchre, and the Latin quarter Acre became the de facto capital after Jerusalem's fall in 1187. The most diverse city, housing Franks, Italians, Muslims, Jews, and Eastern Christians in separate but adjacent quarters. Famous for its bustling markets and vibrant nightlife, Tripoli, marked by strong Provençal influence with a large southern French community. A center of learning and translation where many scholars translated Arabic texts into Latin. Antioch retained its Hellenic character with Greek remaining dominant among locals. Served as cultural bridge between Islamic and Christian worlds. Point 3. Rural life, continuity of local traditions in rural areas. Life continued largely unchanged under Crusader rule. The Crusaders implemented a rural feudal system granting peasant farmers, mostly Muslim, considerable autonomy in exchange for taxes. Key features included continuation of traditional agricultural methods, with introduction of new crops like sugar cane which became major export, preservation of Muslim village religious and social structures, with freedom to practice their faith, construction of massive Crusader castles at strategic locations serving as administrative and military centers controlling surrounding countryside. Maintenance of Islamic wax system in many villages, where agricultural lands were endowed to. Religious institutions. Point 4. Economic system, bridge between East and West. The Crusader states experienced significant economic prosperity, especially in the 12th century. Major sectors included trade, flourished between East and West through Crusader ports like Acre and Tyre. These cities became distribution centers for luxury goods, silks, spices, perfumes, from the Far East and India to Europe. Slave trade also thrived, with slaves imported from Caucasus and Central Asia. Crafts, Crusader cities became renowned for several industries. Glass production in Tyre, learned from local artisans, then developed into major European export. Olive oil soap manufacturing, especially in Nablus, where Crusaders advanced production techniques. Weapon and armor production in Antioch and Tripoli, combining European techniques with Eastern materials. Agriculture, Crusaders introduced improvements, especially in sugar cane cultivation, which was produced on large plantations, similar to colonies, in coastal plains. They also developed irrigation systems in arid areas, adopting local expertise. Point 5. Religious life, coexistence and tension. The Crusader states witnessed both religious intolerance and interfaith coexistence. Latin Church controlled holy sites and major religious institutions. Crusaders rebuilt the Church of Holy Sepulchre in Romanesque style as religious centerpiece. Military orders, like Templars and Hospitallers, who combined monastic and military life, controlling castles and economic networks. Eastern Christians faced discrimination but maintained churches and traditions. Maronites in Lebanon became close Crusader allies. Muslims, barred from Jerusalem except by special permit, but enjoyed worship freedom elsewhere. Mosques continued operating in mixed cities like Acre. Jews lived in special quarters, mostly working as merchants and moneylenders. Some Jewish religious centers flourished in Galilee. Point 6. Architecture and arts, fusion of influences. Crusaders developed distinctive architectural and artistic styles blending European and Eastern traditions. Religious architecture, Crusader churches followed Romanesque style with early Gothic elements and Eastern decorations. Church of Saint and in Jerusalem exemplifies this fusion. Military architecture, advanced castle designs combined European features, high walls, round towers, with Eastern defensive techniques, double walls, arrow slits. Carrack and Croc de Chevaliers represent this evolution. Civil architecture showed Islamic influence, especially in covered markets, public baths, and palaces. The Acre Governor's Palace featured Islamic-style gardens and fountains. Decorative arts, flourished in illuminated manuscripts where Crusader artists blended Islamic floral patterns with Christian figurative art. Glazed pottery production combined Fatimid techniques with European colors. 7. Social structure, interaction and stratification. Crusader society was hierarchical but allowed some social mobility. Ruling elite, Crusader princes and barons living in fortified castles, initially maintaining European lifestyles but gradually adopting Eastern customs in dress and cuisine. Middle class, included Italian merchants, in special coastal quarters, skilled craftsmen of various faiths, and state-employed translators and physicians. Peasants, the vast majority, mostly Muslim farmers. Continuing traditional work under heavier taxation. Slaves, important economic class including war captives and imports from Caucasus and Eastern Europe. 8. Gender roles, shifting dynamics. Crusader society showed some gender role changes compared to Europe. Crusader women enjoyed unusual independence, especially when men were at war. Some like Queen Melisende, 1131–1153, played significant political roles. Interfaith marriage occurred between Crusaders and Eastern Christians, especially in 2nd/3rd generation settlers. Muslim Crusader marriages were rare and discouraged. Muslim women maintained traditional roles, though some sources mention Muslim women interacting with Crusader authorities on inheritance and trade matters. 9. Food and clothing, cultural exchange. Daily life showed significant local adaptation. Cuisine, Crusaders adopted local foods like rice, eggplant, sugar, and citrus while introducing European wine and hard cheese. Clothing, initially kept European attire but gradually adopted Eastern elements like loose summer robes. Women especially adopted local embroidery and silk fashions. 10. Education and culture, knowledge bridge. The Crusader states became centers of translation and learning. Cultural centers, schools in Acre and Tripoli educated Crusader and Eastern Christian children together. Some Crusader elites learned Arabic and studied Islamic philosophy/science. Translation, Eastern Christian scholars translated scientific and philosophical texts from Arabic to Latin, contributing to Europe's intellectual revival. Cultural exchange, while Crusaders learned Arab medicine and science, they introduced European literary traditions like lyric poetry to the East. 11. Entertainment and festivals, blended traditions. Leisure activities reflected cultural mixing. Religious festivals, major events uniting all communities, especially Jerusalem's Easter celebrations attracting European pilgrims. Sports, Crusaders adopted local pastimes like falconry while introducing European sword tournaments. Public baths continued as social centers under stricter regulations to prevent impropriety. 12. Medicine and healthcare, Eastern superiority. Crusaders heavily relied on local medical expertise. Hospitals, hospitalers developed advanced medical facilities in Jerusalem and Acre building on Islamic models. Medical practice, many Crusaders, including royalty, preferred treatment by Muslim physicians more advanced than European counterparts. Diseases, Crusaders suffered from unfamiliar ailments like dysentery and eye infections, increasing dependence on local medical knowledge. 13. Justice and law, parallel systems. The legal system was complexly layered. Frankish courts applied European feudal law to Crusaders. Ecclesiastical courts handled Christian religious matters. Sharia courts continued for Muslim communities. Commercial courts developed sophisticated trade laws in port cities. 14. Language and communication, linguistic diversity. Languages reflected demographic diversity. Old French, elite and administrative language. Arabic, lingua franca with locals. Italian, dominant among coastal merchants. Local languages, like Greek in Antioch and Syriac in countryside. 15. Decline and fall, internal and external factors. The Crusader states gradually fell to Mamluks due to internal factors. Crusader divisions, declining European immigration, resource mismanagement. External factors, rise of unified Mamluk state, shifting regional power balance, fading European support. Conclusion, enduring legacy. Despite their fall, the Crusader states left lasting impacts. Architectural legacy visible in castles and churches. Cultural influence on local customs and traditions. Historical memory shaping Eastern perceptions of the West. Lessons in civilizational interaction between conflict and coexistence. The fall of the Crusader states, a comprehensive analytical study, 1187–1291 AD. The collapse of the Crusader states in the Levant represents an exceptionally significant phase in both Islamic and European history. This downfall was not a sudden event but rather the culmination of accumulating military, political, economic, and social factors over the course of a full century. In this extensive analysis, we will examine in detail the successive stages of the disappearance of organized Crusader presence in the East, beginning with the seismic shock of the Battle of Hattin in 1187, through the attempts at survival during the 13th century, and concluding with the decisive blow represented by the fall of Acre in 1291. Phase 1, the initial earthquake, 1187 to 1192 AD, the Battle of Hattin on July 4, 1187, served as the cataclysmic event that shook the foundations of Crusader presence in the Levant. The Muslim leader Saladin, who had successfully unified Egypt and Syria under his banner, demonstrated exceptional military acumen in delivering a crushing blow to the main Crusader army. With strategic brilliance, Saladin chose the battlefield near the Sea of Galilee, forcing the Crusaders to fight under extremely harsh climatic and geographical conditions. The Crusader army under Guy of Lusignan marched from Saphuria toward Tiberias under scorching sun without adequate water supplies for the troops. The battle developed through three main stages. First, Saladin's forces set fire to the dry grass around Crusader positions, intensifying their suffering from the extreme heat and thick smoke. Second, the Muslims launched successive attacks against the exhausted Crusaders, exploiting their superiority in light cavalry and maneuverability. Third came the complete collapse of Crusader organization as remnants of the army were trapped at the so-called Horns of Hattin, where King Guy and senior Crusader leaders were captured. The battle's outcome proved catastrophic for the Crusaders, near total destruction of their main army, followed by the fall of most Crusader cities in subsequent weeks, including Jerusalem on October 2, 1187. However, some coastal cities like Tyre and Sidon remained under Crusader control thanks to arriving naval reinforcements from Europe. Phase 2, Rescue Attempts, 1189 to 1250 AD, the fall of Jerusalem prompted Pope Gregory VIII to call for the Third Crusade, 1189 to 1192, which involved three of Europe's most powerful monarchs of the time, Frederick Barbarossa, Holy Roman Emperor, who drowned in the Salef River in Anatolia in 1190, Philip II of France, who returned to Europe after disputes with Richard, and Richard the Lionheart of England, who became the expedition's primary leader. This period witnessed one of the most significant sieges of the Middle Ages, the Siege of Acre, 1189 to 1191, which lasted 2 full years and caused massive losses on both sides. The siege ended with the city's surrender to the Crusaders on July 12, 1191, following the arrival of Richard and Philip's forces. However, Richard committed a grave strategic error by ordering the execution of approximately 2,700 Muslim prisoners, which intensified mutual hatred and became a painful memory in Islamic consciousness. The most significant outcome of this phase was the Treaty of Ramla in 1192, which permitted Christian pilgrimages to Jerusalem without weapons, maintained Crusader control of the coast from Tyre to Jaffa, but represented implicit recognition of Crusader inability to recapture Jerusalem or restore their former military prestige. Phase 3, Gradual Collapse, 1250 to 1291 AD, the 13th century witnessed fundamental shifts in regional power dynamics, most notably the rise of the Mamluks as a military and political force in Egypt and Syria. Meanwhile, divisions among the Crusaders themselves intensified, particularly between the Italian city-states, Genoa and Venice, competing for commercial influence, and among various Crusader factions disagreeing about strategies to confront emerging challenges. Key events of this period included the Battle of Almansurah, 1250, a devastating Crusader defeat during the Seventh Crusade led by Louis IX of France, the fall of Antioch, 1268, captured by Mamluk Sultan Baybars after a brief siege. The fall of Tripoli, 1289, by Sultan Kalawan's forces, ending one of the last Crusader states. The fall of Acre, 1291, marking the formal and actual end of organized Crusader presence in the Levant. Military factors in the collapse. The Crusaders' military collapse can be attributed to several key factors. First, the growing military superiority of Muslim forces, as their leaders developed new tactics against heavy Crusader cavalry, with intensive use of trebuchets and advanced siege weapons. Unified command under sultans like Saladin and Baybars gave Muslim armies significant strategic advantage. Second, Crusader strategic errors, including military dispersion in defending distant castles, excessive reliance on static fortifications without sufficient field forces, and failure to establish lasting alliances with local powers in the region. Political and diplomatic factors. Political elements played a decisive role in accelerating the collapse. First, internal divisions among crusaders themselves, whether between different institutions, royalty, military orders, Italian cities, or among military leaders regarding optimal strategies to address new threats. Second, the success of Muslim leaders, particularly Saladin and later the Mamluks, in unifying Egypt and Syria under single leadership, while developing effective intelligence networks against the Crusaders and exploiting Crusader disputes for political and military gains. Economic and social factors. Several economic and social factors contributed to weakening the Crusader states. First, progressive economic deterioration from collapse of agricultural systems due to constant warfare, disruption of overland trade routes following loss of interior regions, and declining financial support from increasingly disinterested Europe. Second, serious demographic problems as Crusader numbers dwindled from decreased European immigration, growing reliance on unreliable mercenaries, while Crusader settlers remained isolated from local populations without genuine integration. Cultural and religious factors. This period witnessed profound cultural and religious transformations. First, declining European religious enthusiasm for holy war, as the papacy became preoccupied with internal European conflicts, and new religious movements focused on internal reform rather than external wars. Second, a major Islamic revival spreading jihad ideology against Crusaders, effectively employing religious discourse to unify ranks, with religious schools emphasizing resistance against foreign invaders. Regional and international repercussions. The fall of the Crusader states had far-reaching consequences. For the Islamic world, the Mamluks' prestige grew as defenders of Islam, international trade routes shifted in favor of Islamic networks, and a new era of Egyptian-Syrian unity began under Mamluk leadership. For Europe, a profound cultural shock from Jerusalem's loss redirected Crusader energies toward other regions like North Africa and Eastern Europe, while prompting critical reassessment of the Crusades' justification. Lessons from the collapse. The Crusader states' fall offers crucial lessons. First, military lessons about the limitations of static defenses without effective field forces, the importance of unified command against major challenges, and the necessity of adapting strategies to changing environments. Second, political lessons revealing the dangers of internal division against a unified enemy, the value of diplomatic flexibility in international relations, and the limits of military power without solid political foundations. Conclusion. End of an early colonial project. The fall of the Crusader states marks the demise of one of the boldest colonial projects of the Middle Ages. Despite surviving 2 centuries, these states ultimately failed because they couldn't create shared identity with local populations. They over-relied on external support. They failed to adapt to regional changes. They misunderstood local cultural depth and regional particularities. The Crusader states' collapse remains a historical lesson about the difficulty of maintaining foreign entities in hostile environments, and the limitations of military power without cultural and civilizational foundations. This historical experience proves that projects based on brute force without genuine popular support are doomed to fail sooner or later. The legacy of the Crusades and their impact on East-West relations. The Crusades represent one of the most influential historical periods in shaping relations between the Islamic and Christian worlds. Despite ending over 7 centuries ago, their legacy remains alive in the collective memory of both sides and continues to influence mutual stereotypes and perceptions to this day. This comprehensive analysis examines the long-term consequences of the Crusades across multiple dimensions: political, cultural, religious, and psychological. Point 1. Political legacy. Seeds of protracted conflict. The Crusades created a complex political legacy that still influences international relations. First, on the geopolitical level, they established a pattern of mutual distrust between the Islamic world and Christian Europe. The roots of many modern Middle Eastern conflicts can be traced back to this historical period. Second, in the Islamic world, the concept of Western invasion became entrenched as a persistent and recurring threat. This perception has remained alive in Islamic political discourse, particularly during confrontations with Western powers in modern times. Third, for Europe, the Crusader experience represented the first large-scale colonial project beyond the continent, laying foundations for later European colonial expansion. Point 2. Cultural legacy, a bridge between civilizations despite their conflictual nature. The Crusades facilitated a unique civilizational encounter. First, in knowledge transfer, they became a major channel for transmitting scientific and philosophical knowledge from the Islamic world to Europe. Numerous Arabic texts on medicine, astronomy, mathematics, and chemistry were translated into Latin during this period. Second, in architecture, the cultural interaction produced significant developments in construction techniques, particularly in fortification systems and palaces. Crusader castles in the Levant represented a blend of European and Eastern military traditions. Third, in daily life, Crusaders introduced numerous Eastern cultural elements to Europe, from clothing and cuisine to personal hygiene practices, like public baths. Point 3. Religious legacy, clash of identities. The Crusader conflict deeply impacted mutual religious perceptions. First, in Islam, jihad became entrenched as a response to foreign aggression. Figures like Saladin emerged as symbols of Islamic unity against foreign invasion. Second, in Christianity, the Crusader experience led to re-evaluations of holy war concepts and church-state relations, contributing to early reform movements. Third, for interfaith relations, the Crusades created deep wounds that complicated Muslim-Christian dialogue for centuries. Point 4. Psychological legacy, entrenched stereotypes. The Crusades contributed to enduring mutual perceptions. First, the Islamic image of the West as bloodthirsty crusaders eager to seize Muslim lands under any pretext persists in some political and religious discourses today. Second, the European image of Muslims as intolerant barbarians opposed to civilization and progress remained influential in European literature and art into modern times. Point 5. Impact on the Islamic world. The Crusades had profound effects on the Islamic world's development. First, politically, they strengthened political centralization in Egypt and Syria, with powerful states like the Ayyubid and Mamluk dynasties emerging in response to the Crusader threat. Second, militarily, they prompted significant advances in warfare and fortifications, particularly in siege warfare and catapult technology. Third, intellectually, they stimulated partial scientific and religious revival as response to the Crusader challenge, with flourishing schools and libraries. Point 6. Impact on Europe. The Crusades altered Europe's developmental trajectory in several ways. First, economically, they opened new trade routes with the East, enriching Italian cities as commercial intermediaries and contributing to Europe's primitive capital accumulation. Second, culturally, they exposed Europe to advanced Islamic civilization, sparking scientific curiosity that helped ignite the Renaissance. Third, politically, they weakened feudalism by freeing peasants from manorial obligations, while lords were away crusading. Point 7. The Crusades and historical memory. Narratives of the Crusades differ markedly between East and West. First, in Islamic historical accounts, the Crusades appear as savage colonial invasions, while Saladin and other Muslim leaders are portrayed as liberators. Second, in traditional European narratives, the Crusades are remembered as heroic, if ultimately failed, epics to reclaim the Holy Land. Third, modern historical scholarship offers more balanced interpretations, viewing the Crusades as complex phenomena combining religious, economic, and political motivations. Point 8. Contemporary political use of Crusader legacy. The Crusader legacy remains politically instrumentalized. First, in Islamist discourse, Crusader memory mobilizes anti-Western sentiment, with contemporary Western policies in the Middle East described as new crusades. Second, in some Western rhetoric, Crusader is used pejoratively to describe aggressive policies, or positively when defending Christian values against Islam. Third, in the Arab-Israeli conflict, both sides invoke Crusader history. Palestinians comparing Zionist occupation to Crusader occupation, while some Israelis see the Crusaders as historical precedent for failed foreign presence in the region. Point 9. Lessons for present and future. The Crusades offer important lessons for contemporary international relations. First, the danger of reducing complex conflicts to religious or civilizational clashes, which intensifies confrontation and precludes compromise. Second, the importance of understanding historical contexts of current conflicts without reducing the present to mere repetition of the past. Third, the possibility of coexistence and cultural exchange even during intense conflicts, as seen during lulls in Crusader warfare. Point 10. Conclusion. An enduring legacy. The Crusader legacy remains alive and evolving. First, as a lesson in the dangers of religious and cultural intolerance, and how political conflicts can become civilizational clashes. Second, as testimony to humanity's capacity for extreme cruelty yet also for coexistence and cultural exchange. Third, as warning against exploiting history for narrow political ends and distorting collective memory to serve present agendas. Despite the centuries, the Crusades remain a mirror reflecting many of our contemporary challenges: civilizational clashes, identity conflicts, foreign intervention dilemmas, and the problematic relationship between religion and politics. Their careful study represents not just an examination of the past, but an attempt to understand our present and anticipate our future.